magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Rejoice, children of Assyrian, and make ready the court of the young king, for bloody-handed Cain is stirring, and the infinity circuit thrills with songs of war. Or, to put it another way, it's finally here. I have frankly never been this excited for any 40K related release ever. Like many of you, I have spent months poring over every clue, every leak, every reveal concerning what is probably the biggest Craftworlds update since 3rd edition. And those of us who are motivated Discord and Facebook users have had access to the majority of this content for the last several weeks, if not longer. But there is simply no substitute for feeling the weight of the book in your hand and contemplating the elegantly brutal shenanigans that are about to transform the way that we visit destruction on the lesser denizens of the 41st millennium. Here is my unbridled and totally honest first reaction. This book rocks. Not only have Craftworld Eldar gotten a significant and much-needed competitive boost, but the rules gracefully convey the character and fighting style of the Aeldari better than ever before. Aspect warriors are terrifying. Asuryani technology puts most Imperial tech to shame, and Eldar war hosts are finally the lithe, adaptable symphonies of synergistic brutality that they always should be. That said, because of the new point values, every lost Eldari life is keenly felt. This is a faction that richly rewards optimal play, but is as intolerant of errors as the Beltani are of pretty much every other species in the galaxy. I don't think we're in danger of seeing Craftworld Eldar suddenly dominate top tables the way Drukhari did when they first arrived, but I do think that in the hands of highly skilled players, Craftworld Eldar just became a faction that can win grand tournaments, something that almost never happened in 9th edition. And now I don't think that's a stretch at all. In the weeks ahead, I will post updated strategy guides on the website, new unit focus videos on my YouTube channel, and a variety of deep dives on new combos, tactics, and tricks. In the next day or so, I plan to post a 5-part full codex review on my YouTube channel that will explore the new faction abilities, sub-faction bonuses, stratagems, relics, psychic powers, secondary missions, and all of the data sheets. I will add content related to Harlequins much later in March, maybe early April, and I'll get to the Ynnari as soon as I can reasonably get to them. All I'm going to do in this video is make some observations in broad brushstrokes about how space elves have been transformed in the new book, and that is the right adjective. And I will also tell you a few of the options that I'm personally most excited about, but this is very much a general overview. Many of the things that I say and the topics that I'm going to cover, I will revisit and expand on in later content. And frankly, some of them might turn out to be just plain wrong, because after all, most of us haven't had much time to experiment with the new rules, and all the theory craft in the world is just no substitute for play experience at the table. But here we go. Observation number 1. Craftworld Eldar just became an even more elite army. Your next Craftworlds list is likely going to have 1 or 2 fewer units than whatever you've run most recently, because it's all a bit more expensive. But everything in your roster will hit considerably harder than it did before, except Dark Reapers. I think one of the biggest surprises in the new book is just how much damage output almost every single unit has. We all expected improvements to the Bright Lance and the Shuriken Cannon that would bring them in line with the Drukhari versions of those weapons, and we got those. And I personally hoped that Shuriken Catapults would get some extra range and that melee Aspect Warriors would get another attack, and they did. What I did not expect is that all Shuriken weapons would get native AP, or that Dire Avengers would increase their shooting output by 50%, or that Banshee Swords would go to -4 AP and +1 to wound on the charge in addition to those extra attacks, or for the Exarch with Mirror Swords to be able to put out 10 attacks per turn at flat 2 damage. And the list just goes on and on and on. Everything can hit like an absolute sledgehammer, and doesn't rely, in order to do so, on a concert of successful psychic powers and CP expenditure. That stuff helps, but it's no longer necessary to create exactly the right synergies just to get your units to where they should be for the points. Now the data sheets are strong are strong going in to any modifiers or bonuses that you add. Pretty much every unit in the book is significantly more vicious and has access to some sort of new and improved utility power or trick or combo that makes it a serious contender for a spot in the right competitive list. It's going to be really hard for me to do the best units and how to use them update, because frankly, everything in this book has some kind of potential in competitive lists with almost no exception. There are exceptions with almost no exceptions. On the flip side, increased unit costs mean that Craftworld players will be even less able to afford early game casualties than before, and we will need to seriously rethink the way we play primary objectives, conduct unit trades, and the way we select secondary missions. For example, I think I'm probably going to find myself leaning into behind enemy lines rather than engage on all fronts, my previous go-to, simply because behind enemy lines makes it possible to score 4 points per turn with only just 2 units in position, while engage on all fronts requires at least 4 units in order to score 3 points per turn, and I'm just not convinced that we will have enough warm bodies on the table, or frankly enough disposable MSU units to send into dangerous quadrants in order to make that work consistently. I also think that we're probably looking at significantly more of the army starting in Deep Strike or in Reserve, which is certainly not a bad thing. It's very Eldari. Thematically, all of this makes sense. What Craftworld Eldar have going for them is the most advanced technology in the galaxy and a highly specialized warrior caste and access to the webway. And what we have against us is numbers. There simply aren't enough Asuryani left for other species to worry about losing ground to what remains of this once magnificent civilization. So it makes sense, right, that on the table Craftworlders would excel at damage output and ambushes, but be ill able to afford losses. And that is very much the reality of the new book. One more note on this sort of shift, not only in the shift to the army becoming more elite, that is, units hit harder, but you have fewer of them, but also just the sort of general makeover that the faction has gotten. I think that some of those rare players out there who were enjoying a measure of competitive success with the last Codex, maybe going 4-1 at some of the large tournaments, might look at the new book and initially feel like it's a splash of cold water, because many of the tricks and unit trading tactics that we relied on to get the most out of Eldar previously are gone. So if you're a competitive player who wanted a book that would make exactly what you were doing even more effective, you might initially be disappointed. And that's an understandable first reaction. But I really think if you have some patience and you're able to step back and see the faction with fresh eyes, you will be able to find ways to make Craftworld Eldar more effective than before. It took a great player to make the last book work. And so if you are making the last book work, you've got to be good at this game. And I feel confident that this book has an even higher skill cap than the last one did. But things are going to be different. Here's my second big observation. This might be the single deepest codex in the game at the moment. And by deep, I do not mean profound or existentially enlightening or likely to excite the romantic wiles of 90s theater girls who attend circus camp in the summers. What I mean is there are probably dozens of possibilities for effective competitive builds, many of which we will still only just be discovering a year or two from now. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. The first is that every single one of those sub-factions, the different Craftworld options, has potential for competitive play, as do some of the build-your-own options. And so each of those will add a different lens that changes the way you play all of the units in the book. And if each of those lenses is viable, it just exponentially creates the possibility for builds. I do think, and again, I could be wrong about this, I think that Ulthwé and Beltan stand out as obvious frontrunners because they have access to rerolls and other bonuses that benefit the whole army, and a bunch of other bonuses that create opportunities for really sneaky synergies. So just one example, if you look closely at the datasheet for support weapon platforms, you'll see that it now has the Guardians keyword. Also, it hasn't gotten the same kind of CP hike that a lot of other units have. So a player could use the unique Ulthwé stratagem Discipline of the Black Guardians for 1 CP to make a unit of 3 support platforms hit on 2s, and the new Martial Citizenry stratagem to let them reroll 1s. And this is especially brutal on a unit of affordably pointed D cannons that now do D6 plus 2 damage and inflict additional mortal wounds on 6s, that now hit on 2s, reroll 1s, and ignore line of sight. That is nasty. And that's with no psychic support, no casts that can fail. And that's just one thing Ulthwé can do. And there are lots of things. I think Eandon is also a really, really solid pick. And I'm not sure it's less strong than these first two. I think that these first two are just very obviously good. Eandon makes typically fragile Craftworld's units surprisingly durable by reducing the AP of opponents' weapons from a -1 to a 0 and from a -2 to a -1. If it goes to -3, then you don't get to reduce it. But this means that, say, a unit of Guardian Defenders with a support platform and cover save on a 2+ if you take the shots to the support platform while ignoring AP -1 and still saving on a 3+ against AP -2. That's crazy, especially if you consider the application for Wraithguard with cannons or Fire Dragons with, in addition to having a 3+ save, also now are toughness 4, or even Shadow Specters, which have a native -1 to hit and the 3+ save that becomes a 2+. And now that Wind Riders have a 3+ save, and in the end, unless they have real staying power, right? And we're barely scratching the surface here. I think Eandon is going to be especially strong in low point value games, but also a powerhouse in 2,000 point play. Aleitok and Samhan are also good. They're also strong. And I'll talk a little bit about Aleitok later, and I'll talk about Samhan in depth when I do the full Codex review. I will say I think that these two are more vulnerable to unfavorable matchups than Ulthwé is or than Biel-Tan. And for that reason, I think they just, in terms of like the ability to go all the way in a grand tournament or something, I think maybe they're not quite as strong, but they're still very good and certainly viable for high performance competitive play. And that's the bottom line. Every major craft world is competitively viable. But not only that, the custom craft worlds, now called far-flung craft worlds, have a number of exciting possibilities for serious competitive play. These tend to lean into much more narrowly specialized boutique builds than the mainstream craft worlds, which I think is appropriate. I think one of the things that really bugged me in 8th edition was the degree to which the majority of the craft worlds, the mainstream craft worlds, basically streamlined you into very particular builds. And it seems like the mainstream craft worlds, except maybe, I mean, it makes sense, right, for Samhan to have really good Wind Riders. And that's actually one of the things one of the only things in the Codex that I found slightly disappointing is that Samhan Wind Riders are not the best Wind Riders, and their faction bonus doesn't really affect them. And again, when I do the full Codex review, we'll talk about that. But there are ways to make Wind Riders really good. I think they will be good in the new Codex. And if you want to lean into sort of a narrow band of a particular type of unit, the far-flung craft worlds custom options are great for this. So, for example, Hail of Doom offers a way to make a specialized shuriken-oriented list just an absolute monster to deal with. While Swift Strikes and Strikers, or whatever it is, and Children of the Open Skies, these can be combined for this super nasty alpha strike hit and run list where you have these units that are moving long distances, and then you're treating them as though they didn't move, so they get various bonuses, and your melee units can get there faster because they're at +1, and they can't roll less than a 3 when they advance and charge if they're Howling Banshees, and there's all this great stuff. And then there are numerous other viable options and combos, including traits like Vengeful and Savage Blades if you want to dial your close combat units up to 11. Whereas if you want to do a melee-oriented Wraith list and you take Wrath of the Dead, it becomes just savagely janky because now all of your Wraiths can heroically intervene. And again, I think that those custom craft world, far-flung craft world options, the majority of them probably don't quite compete with the mainstream ones, but I think some of them really do. And there's a lot of depth there for different kinds of builds and different kinds of like specialty boutique builds that is going to just keep, even if you collect no other armies, your options for play styles and unit combinations, I think is going to remain fresh into 10th edition because this Codex is what it is, and that's exciting. Also, as an Ibersil player, I especially appreciate the inclusion of a custom Craftworld option called In the Footsteps of the Ancients, which allows a player to make use of faction bonuses, stratagems, and warlord traits from one of the conventional Craftworlds, so that I don't have to look my opponent in the eye at a tournament and claim that my conspicuously blue and white models sporting Ibersil banners are actually from Craftworld Ulthway. That feels bad. You don't get the relics and the special characters, and I think that's fair, right? There should be some advantage to having committed all the way to the Ulthway scheme. But one of the advantages to choosing a lesser craft world, yeah, there's not as much lore about your craft world, and you don't get those special characters, but you do have this tremendous flexibility to play them pretty much any way you want, and that's cool. And the Codex supports that. And generally, I think people who go for less mainstream craft worlds, that's one of the things that they're looking for, and I like that the design team has honored that. So the sub-faction options are great, and they're combined with a plethora of really good data sheets. The majority of the data sheets in this book are very good. Some powerful stratagems, some really good relics, and you can now also give Exarchs special Exarch relics, thank goodness. That's kind of standard in 9th edition at this point, and it really makes a difference. There are new Exarch powers. That's a mixed bag. There are new warlord traits that are good, psychic powers, and the ability for Craftworld armies to take a detachment of Harlequin allies from one of 3 different Harlequin subfactions. All of that stuff combined that can then be sort of exponentially multiplied through the lens of all of those viable subfactions means that this probably is the single deepest codex in the game. And don't get me wrong, there are still some total duds in pretty much all of those categories. But overall, what we have now in this book is more than enough to keep us all busy coming up with fresh ways to play for years. Here's my third observation. Strands of Fate, the new faction ability, is definitely super powerful, but requires players to remain strategically flexible. Craft worlds have historically been, I think there was one edition where this was not true. Historically, they've been a high skill cap army where they could be pretty difficult for new players, but in the hands of somebody with a lot of experience who really knows how to use them, really powerful. And I think we're even more in that position maybe than honestly, the book was so hard to use in 8th that I think you probably did have to be a really skilled player. But I think you can certainly, in the hands of a skilled player, this faction is super powerful. And although I think it's going to be easier than it used to be for newer players, I think it will be a little tricky. And Strands of Fate is like a wonderful microcosm for why this is the case. So if you either don't have the Codex yet or you're just starting to get the hang of all this stuff, Strands of Fate is a faction ability that reflects the innate psychic talents of all Craftworlders and the Farseer's ability to provide guidance based on knowledge of possible futures. Before each battle round, a Craftworld's player rolls 6 dice, and in a 2,000 point game, gets to select and keep 4 of those. Now, each of these dice can be used as an automatic roll of a 6 for a particular type of dice roll. So if you rolled any 1s, you could select those and then use them later to make an advance roll automatically a 6 before you roll the dice. 2s are for charge rolls, 3s are for psychic tests, 4s are for hit rolls, 5s are for wound rolls, and 6s are saving throws. And each Farseer in your army allows you to reroll one of these dice before selecting which ones you're keeping. And also, there are some sub-faction bonuses that let you roll additional dice or keep additional dice. So what Strands of Fate does is it creates opportunities for some enormously powerful plays. You could, for example, bring in a unit of Wraithblades from Deep Strike and use a Strands of Fate die plus Ghost Walk to make the unit auto-succeed on a charge, because if you set one of your charge dice to a 6, the worst thing you can roll on the other one is a 1, and Ghost Walk gives you +2 to the charge, so if you're coming in 9 inches from enemy models, even if you roll a 1 on the 1d6 you are rolling, you still get there. Or you could guarantee the success of a particular psychic power, because a lot of the psychic powers are warp charge value 6 now, and so if one of your dice is a 6, you can't fail. Or if you're running Seer Council or something else that gives you +1 on something with a warp charge value of 7, you couldn't fail. You could use Strands of Fate to be absolutely certain that your bike autarch with objective secured, yes, there is a way to do this now. There's a killer relic that you can give to any character with a jet bike that gives them a 20-inch move and objective secured, which is just crazy good. So you could make your bike autarch with objective secured automatically shrug off the first two enemy Blaz cannon shots, even if you don't have Lookout Sir going for you. In fact, I think it's totally reasonable to suggest that judicious use of Strands of Fate will, if you are using it judiciously and you play a lot, it will swing games in your favor that otherwise would have been losses. It's a really good power. The challenge to using it effectively is not knowing which dice rolls to prioritize, and also being able to remain sufficiently flexible in your plan that if you don't get the Strands of Fate numbers you needed, there's still something else good that you can do with the dice you did get. And this is in part because the rules writers have very sensibly limited our ability to control or modify the dice. So there are ways to reroll dice, and there are ways to keep an extra die, but there's nothing that lets you, for example, add +1 or -1 to a Strands of Fate die, which, and at that point, like, it would be basically certain that you could get any number you needed. And as a result, it's simply not safe to gamble on definitely getting what you need in any category. And I think that's good. I think that creates more interesting play opportunities and rewards a type of tactical flexibility that is very Aeldari. A lot of the codexes like that. The tools that are available are enormously powerful, but they require a player to remain tactically supple, depending on an opponent's list and who gets first turn and so on, to make changes. And from a fluff and a lore perspective, this is just absolutely perfect. Okay. Observation number 4. The role of psychic powers has shifted. There is a new top dog psychic power in town, and it's called the Will of Assyrian. It has a warp charge value of 6. It affects a single core or character unit within 18 inches of the caster, and it has the following effects until your next psychic phase. The unit gains objective secured, the unit cannot fail morale tests, the unit can perform an action and still shoot. I really cannot emphasize how insanely good this is. Not only can you give OPSEC to durable infantry like Wraithblades or a Wraithlord, which is now an elite unit, but you could give OPSEC to an MSU Windrider team that is only 60 points and can move 22 inches to strip an opponent of a key objective. A unit of Shining Spears could move on to an objective with an enemy that is an OPSEC unit, shoot the crap out of it until it has fewer models than the spears, and still perform a scanning action and dominate the objective. That's so good. Primary objective scoring is probably still the single greatest challenge for Craftworlds, and Will of Assyrian is arguably the most potent tool that we have to mitigate that weakness. Some of you out there are thinking, no, it's the Webway Gate. And to you I say, stay a while. I have some thoughts on the Webway Gate. On the other hand, every previously existing psychic power, except for one, I think, has been significantly nerfed. Doom and Guide now only provide rerolls to core and character units, which means that vehicles no longer have significant synergy with your casters. Vehicles also no longer benefit from the Autarch's reroll aura. One of the reasons that I think Beltan and Ulthway are somewhat standout picks is that their sub-faction reroll bonuses, so Beltan lets you reroll a hit roll, and Ulthway lets you reroll a wound roll. Each of them essentially has one half of the old expert crafters. Those are some of the only ways to give rerolls to vehicles. And so you can include vehicles in those lists and have them earn their keep at a much higher degree of reliability than in the other factions. And I think that's going to end up counting for a lot. Other psychic changes. Protect and Jinx no longer affect invulnerable saves, which that's huge. I think that both are still good and worth taking, and I think that a lot of us will see that they no longer affect invuln saves and just want to completely veer away from using them because that's what we were using them for before. But I really think there's still a place for those powers. I think we just have to think differently about the role that they're going to play in our lists and what sorts of weapons we're going to use them in conjunction with. This one hurts. Units that have been quickened can no longer shoot and can no longer charge. That's huge. Fortune now only benefits core and character units. Again, it's big. Also, the standard range of all your Farseer powers has dropped from 24 inches to 18 inches. That is very limiting. And it doesn't stop there. Runes of Fortune no longer replace Smite. Instead, they take the place of another power. And this is going to be tough because Runes of Fortune tend to be powerful tools, but much more situational than Runes of Fate and Runes of Battle. So the ability to swap them in for Smite made your Farseers in the old version of your Warlocks, so I think more tactically supple, and now they're a little bit more rigid. That's balanced out insofar as Warlocks are now elites, not HQs, and you get a free Warlock slot for every Farseer in your army, so they won't be jostling for those incredibly precious HQ slots, but nevertheless, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to fit the powers that you want into your list. Farseers also no longer have automatic rerolls, and Seer Council no longer benefits both the Farseer and a nearby Warlock, only the Farseer. And it only works if a nearby Conclave is still alive. You have to have at least 2 models. And because Conclaves are not characters, they don't benefit from Lookout Sir. And so your plucky footlock attachés might be just quickly eliminated by opponents like Tau with powerful indirect fire. In certain matchups, your opponent will just be able to essentially kill those units out of hand, which is a good case for taking a single Warlock, which does get the character keyword, but then you can't use Seer Council. Oh, and Long Bomb Jinx is gone. Despite all of that, Psykers will still continue to play an essential role in Craftworld's list. It's just that list composition is going to shift to favor more infantry in order to make use of psychic support, now that vehicles don't benefit as much. And some of the old standbys we relied on, like Ghost Axes with a 3+ invulnerable save, or Shining Spears that can move 32 inches and still charge on turn 1, are going to be replaced by new combos, and that's just the reality. More importantly, I think we will see fewer competitive players leaning into the Psychic phase predominantly for damage multipliers, and instead allotting Psychic casts to scoring-related control powers. So Will of Asuryan is the most obvious example, and we already talked about that. But so too the new and improved versions of Horrify and Restrain. So Horrify now inflicts -2 on a target's leadership and a Fight Last effect until your next Psychic phase. So they always fight last, no matter what. And Fight Last is incredibly powerful. It's better than Fight First because it trumps Fight First, the way it's phrased. That unit can't fight until all other eligible units have done so. It's just a way of guaranteeing that you're going to get the drop on an opponent in melee. Restrain now causes, in addition to what it used to do, now causes any action the target unit attempts to automatically fail, which can really hamper your opponent's scoring in a meta where Retrieve Knockman data remains popular and many missions require actions in order to score primary points. So the ability to just force units to fail is pretty significant. Damage multipliers definitely still have a role to play, and Fortune definitely does, and Ghostwalk definitely does. But I do think that we're going to find ourselves thinking differently about the Psychic phase. And it's not really a problem because, honestly, most of the data sheets, most of the weapons on the data sheets come with such significant improvements that we are already at or above the damage output that we could achieve before with the Psychic enhancements. So you just don't need them in the same way that you needed them before. So I do think this is a net gain, even though it's disappointing to see some of our old tools become a bit floppier. In a list geared towards Shuriken Fire, so for example, I mentioned earlier that you could do, there's a place for a far-flung Craftworld list that's focused on Shuriken weapons, making use of the Hail of Doom Craftworld trait. Combined with Doom, you can make anything that's toughness 7 or less vulnerable to being eliminated by a couple of units of Dire Avengers. And that's amazing. And Fortune is still amazing on Wraith Infantry, holding objectives. And yeah, you can't get them to a 3-up invuln, but now they have -1 to damage, to incoming damage, which is huge. And you can still have your 4-up invuln with your Ghost Shield, and now your Axe hits harder. And Ulthway still get a 6-up invuln that you can use Strands of Fate to make auto succeed. And Ghost Walk used in conjunction with Runes of Fate, as we mentioned before, can make units auto-succeed on charges coming out of Deep Strike. So the psychic tools are still legion and very powerful. They're just different than they were before. And so we're going to have to rethink how we play the psychic phase and where our priorities are. There's also a new version of the Mind War combo, and this probably doesn't really warrant being in my first pass, but it was always one of my favorite tricks for casual play, and I still think it probably doesn't make the grade for the most competitive lists, but it is damn good, and it's better than it was before. So there's a new stratagem called Battle Psychers that lets a mid-size Warlock Conclave trigger both versions of a Runes of Battle power for 1 CP with a single cast. So this means that your Conclave could trigger Embolden and Horrify to give your Farseer +2 leadership and an enemy character -2 leadership. And your Farseer has a native leadership of 9, which is going to be better than most characters to begin with. And there's some pretty simple ways to get him to a 10, more or less for free. So if you then cast Mind War on an enemy character, even with completely average dice, you should do 5 or 6 mortal wounds. And if you use the Strands of Fate for a 6 on one of your casting rolls, you stand a reasonable chance of rolling really well, which triggers a further damage bonus. It's much more elegant than the previous combo involving the Hemlock. And in theory, you could also use a Hemlock and really blow their heads off, but Hemlocks have some problems that I'll talk about when I do the full datasheet review. So I think that's probably less viable. I'm really looking forward to building a Crusade force, though, around this Mind War trick with a really fun storyline about my sort of creepy Eldritch Ibrasili Farseer, whose thing is he blows up people's heads, or her thing, because lots of female Farseers in Craftworld Ibrasil. Lastly, I think we might see Farseers performing more psychic actions. This used to be super unpalatable because performing a psychic action took the place of casting at all, and your Farseer had 2 casts and with a stratagem could cast 3 times. So giving up all of those casts was just really hard to stomach to perform a psychic action that could be denied. But there's a new stratagem called the Multifaceted Mind that allows a Farseer to perform a single cast in the same turn that she attempts a psychic action. And this opens up some of the Warpcraft secondary objectives, at least against opponents with little to no psychic denial. So I still think it's not a great idea to choose Warpcraft secondaries against opponents with either significant psychic denial or with bonuses to their psychic denial, because then every turn, in order to score the points that you need, you're dependent on tying or outrolling your opponent on 2d6, and you don't want to be in that. Even if you're winning 2/3 of the time, it's just too easy for them to potentially deny you points while committing almost no resources to do it. So in some matchups, it's going to be a great pick, but I think that even with this new stratagem, it'll still remain a little bit marginal, those Warpcraft secondaries as an option. But there are other kinds of psychic action. For example, there's a new Eldar stratagem called Eldritch Storm, which is actually the return of an old Eldritch, psychic power. And one of the things I love about the new codex is all the callbacks to previous codexes. So Shroud Runners, for example, I'm pretty sure that's a reference to like a piece of war gear in like the 2nd ed codex. There are all of these fun little Easter eggs where it's clear that before they wrote the book, the rules designers went back and did a really in-depth deep dive on not only all of the lore, but all of the old rules going all the way back to certainly 2nd ed, if not the Rogue Trader days. And I think that's super cool. I think that's something that at least the community of longtime players has wanted for a while, to feel like there is that link to past iterations of the faction. So Eldritch Storm, it's not a psychic power, it's a stratagem. You play it in your command phase for 3 CP, so super expensive. You pick a point within 24 inches of a Farseer model and place a marker. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yes, it's like Orbital Barrage, and then they just move away from it, and it has some... No, it's better than that. In your psychic phase, any Farseer can take a psychic action to empower the storm. So this means that you're only able to cast once if you use that stratagem, the Multifaceted Mind, and your other cast is essentially empowering the storm. But this might be worthwhile in the right circumstance, because in your shooting phase, you then roll a d6 for every enemy unit within 6 inches of the point, and on a 2+, that unit takes D3 mortal wounds +1 for every time a Farseer Empower the Storm. And you immediately see why this is better than Orbital Barrage, because your opponent doesn't have the opportunity to outrun it. It just happens on the same turn that you cast it. And that's huge. If your opponent clusters units in some sort of Death Star formation, you can really mess up those units with mortal wounds every turn your opponent chooses to do it. And yeah, it's CP intensive. This is probably not going to be viable in most games, depending on what your meta's like. I mean, maybe in your meta it's great, but there'll be many games in which it's not viable. But there will definitely be matchups in which this is insanely good, especially in missions that require a player to hold the objective in the center of the board. This is a crazy good tool for that. Okay. Observation number 5. Movement Shenanigans just got a makeover. Craftworlders have long relied on speed and tricky movement to bring powerful melee force to bear early and to compensate for their fragility. Although many or most of the old movement tricks are gone, they've been replaced by others that are overall more powerful, even though they don't operate in the same way, and even though we are going to feel, I think, initially the pain of the loss of those old tricks. But I think it's a net gain. There will be growing pains for players who have grown accustomed to using Quicken in literally every game, but we have some new tricks that are super cool. But we're going to start with what we've lost. So here's what's gone or nerfed. Fire and Fade is now 2 CP and no longer allows units to embark on transports. Sorry, Fire Dragons, you can't jump back in transports. Fire Dragons are still good for other reasons, but their role has changed a little bit. Banshees no longer get +2 to charge. Ouch. There are no longer Exarch powers or sub-faction bonuses that provide charge bonuses. I was actually surprised by this, but there's nothing. Zip, nada. No charge bonuses. Court of the Young King is gone. That was an undervalued stratagem back in 8th Ed. Rangers, Scorpions, Warwalkers, none of those have a CP-free Deep Strike anymore. They have something else, but they do not have a CP-free Deep Strike. Quicken is now mutually exclusive with any kind of an attack. And there's some other stuff. Warp Spiders still have Web of Deceit, but only if you pay through the nose for it, and they are more expensive to begin with. So that unit of 5 Warp Spiders that teleports around the board using Web of Deceit is now maybe inefficiently pointed for that particular role. But Warp Spiders hit a lot harder than before, so they're still good. You just think differently about them. Here's what we have gained in exchange for those sacrifices. So the first new movement shenanigan is our other faction ability besides Strands of Fate. It's called Battle Focus. It's not the old Battle... Well, it is the old Battle Focus plus something new. So we can still advance and fire assault and actually now pistol weapons at no penalty, which is cool. But it also allows units to move, then shoot, and then make a battle focus move. Then make, essentially, you move, you shoot, and then you make your advance move for D6. And the immediate implication of that, of course, is that everybody kind of gets like mini Fire and Fade, where potentially you shoot something and you run out of line of sight. A bunch of space elves, shoot you, and they tee-hee-hee-hee-hee, giggle away and run behind something. And it sounds like it would be super annoying and very Eldari to play against. In practice, I think that is actually not going to be the primary use of Battle Focus, and it's going to be a little bit harder to do that than it initially sounds like. Incidentally, only infantry have Battle Focus, but if you give your vehicles... Well, infantry and bikes. But if you give your vehicles vectored engines, they can make a Battle Focus move once per game. And that's... There are definitely some ways to use it to great effect, especially on fire prisms, which I'll talk about in the full Codex review in the next couple of days. There's one more limitation to the Battle Focus move, and that is when you cross any sort of area train, you subtract 3 from your movement. And this does not stack with area train that just comes with a movement penalty, so it's going to be 3. But it does mean that stuff like ruins that doesn't usually hamper your movement will hamper your movement, and it means that there's a significant chance if you are trying to, for example, jump into a ruin, shoot something, and then jump behind the ruin, there's a 50% chance that if you try that your unit will just get stuck and not move at all. Because if you roll a 1, a 2, or a 3 for your battle focus move, your unit just gets stuck in the ruin and is, you've got a bonus to your armor save, but in line of sight of the enemy. Built-in do have a sub-faction-wide ability that allows them to treat battle focus moves of a 1 and a 2 as a 3, which definitely makes it better, especially for ducking around the side of a ruin, but it doesn't actually help you with the avoiding being stuck in the footprint of the ruin, because on a 1, 2, and a 3, you still end up with a 0 for your battle focus move. There is one solution to this that you can do once. The old matchless agility stratagem has changed to enable players to automatically roll a 6 on a battle focus move. So this would get you out of the ruin. You could have one unit. It's essentially an extra Fire and Fade that only costs 1 CP, because Fire and Fade now costs 2 CP. But Fire and Fade also can be used on a wider variety of units. So battle focus, it's really solid, but it is a little trickier to use than is initially apparent. I think that we will find other ways to use this in terms of, I think, like forming screens and shooting and then nipping onto an objective. Maybe you shoot with a weapon that's not an assault or pistol weapon, and then you jump onto an objective is something you could not have done before. I think there are a lot, or just moving your melee units up the field while you wait to charge on a later turn. You can't charge when you make a battle focus move. I think that there are a lot of opportunities to use this well, but I think that the most obvious application is going to be less reliable than might initially appear. And I also have a sneaking suspicion that it was a playtest modification, that maybe they were letting units jump in and out of ruins, and then maybe that didn't survive playtesting. Pure conjecture. All that said, allegedly, maybe Craftworld Eldar, based on rules as written, can just ignore the battle focus movement penalty and move over area terrain and do exactly the thing that I just said you can't do, where you have your unit behind the line of sight blocking ruin, they step into it, they shoot the enemy, and they step out of it, and you're doing that with like every infantry unit in your army, and you're shooting them with everything, and they can't see anything. But it's not crystal clear from the phrasing that this is necessarily true. Craftworld Eldar ignore any and all penalties to their movement characteristic. And although battle focus is a normal move, it's a normal move based on the roll of 1d6. Now, if that d6 then becomes your movement characteristic, it totally works. And I am 95% sure that the intention here is to allow Eldar units to use battle focus unimpeded, and that is the most reasonable interpretation of the rules. But it would still be nice to have an FAQ on this to stymie objections from really grumpy opponents, because I think it is only like 95% clear that that is the case. Honestly, I think that battle focus is a great tool either way. It's going to be excellent in the hands of wily players. It feels very Aeldari. It'll help us keep our fragile units alive, but we are going to have to be a little bit clever about how we make use of it. Okay, that was all one movement shenanigan. Our next new movement shenanigan is advanced positions. Craftworld Eldar finally can have units that deploy into the midfield before the game begins, so long as they remain 9 inches away from enemy units and the enemy deployment zone. This was much needed. For one thing, we finally have the opportunity to screen out our opponents' forward deployment units that might otherwise have been able to be in our backfield turn 1, which always feels bad when you get mobbed with melee turn 1, especially bad for fragile Eldar. And for another, cheap units of rangers in the midfield can block enemy melee units from advancing, and then with their wire weave net, which not only does mortal wounds but takes 2 off the enemy charge, it also, you can make them fail charges, and there's suddenly tremendous opportunity to control the midfield before the game begins in ways that could really determine the outcome of the game. It can help you score action-based primary and secondary missions in early turns, and also just generally be a nuisance to your opponent, especially with those rangers. Another of the units with advanced positions that is suddenly really good is striking scorpions, who were like they were like the tragic case in the previous codex. I think they were sort of like maybe the most tragically underserved Aspect Warrior, and now they're so freaking good. In part because Advanced Positions has opened up this potent option for a first turn play. And by potent option, I actually mean something more like majestically glorious smackdown. You can now deploy up to 3 units of Scorpions, because that's how many you can put in a list, and or their Phoenix Lord 9 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone. And if you get first turn, each of those units can move and charge to create a havoc in your opponent's backfield before your opponent's even taking a turn. And now that Scorpions actually do serious damage in close quarters, the threat is real. I mean, you could potentially devastate your opponent's army on turn 1. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Brent, that's all well and good, but if I don't get turn 1, my Scorpions will just get shot off the board, and they might have a 3+ armor save, but they're just not that tough. Well, if you don't get first turn, you can now use the new version of Phantasm at 2 CP to just pick up all of them and either redeploy them elsewhere or put them into the strategic reserve at no additional CP cost, and then bring them in out of reserve on turn 2 or something and put some Ghost Walk on them and smack your opponent down that. I mean, there's so much opportunity to still make use of those Scorpions. Or maybe you have a Webway Gate, right? That would be another option that we'll talk about later, although I'm a little skeptical of the Webway Gates for reasons we'll get to. It's so good, and it's not only because of the opportunity for a turn 1 blitz, but also because it forces your opponent to make difficult decisions during deployment and perhaps place units in positions that really aren't optimal. So even if you have only 1 unit of Scorpions, and I honestly think a lot of the Aspect Warriors are going to be one-offs in lists, partially because you can only give the Exarch powers to any Aspect Warrior squad once, and you can only give the unique relics to any Exarch once, and so this rewards a variety of aspects. And from a game design perspective, I like this. I mean, don't get me wrong. As an Imbecile player, I love running 3 units of Howling Banshees, but I do think, in general, Eldar War Hosts are supposed to have several different kinds of Aspect Warriors, so they have like a tool for different kinds of obstacle, and this is a way of incentivizing that without by giving you a carrot, not a stick, and I really like that. Even a single unit of Scorpions can really limit what your opponent chooses to do turn 1. I plan to use them a great deal. Shroud Runners. Shroud Runners don't have advanced position, but they do have a 16-inch pregame move, which means on turn 1, they can definitely be in your opponent's backfield. They can definitely help you score behind enemy lines on turn 1 and provide some long-range heavy support, because those scatter lasers, right, that's 36 inches, so you can even do this like on one side of the board and shoot something pretty far away. If you're running Eandon Shroud Runners, they can have a 2+ save if they're in cover, because Shroud Runners can benefit from ruins unlike normal jet bikes, and then with the Eandon bonus, they would ignore AP -1 and suddenly become crazy durable. In general, Shroud Runners are one of the units that I'm most skeptical about, partially because there's just so many great things in the fast attack slot, and one of the hardest aspects of playing Eldar post 9th edition Codex, for reasons that we will get to tomorrow, is finding slots in a list, having enough slots for various things. And there's a lot of stuff that's going to be competing for those fast attack slots, which is a perfect segue to the new Swooping Hawks, which I think I am a little bit in love with. These were the first Aspect Warriors I ever bought back in like the 90s, and the killer elves with wings are one of the units that I am most excited about in the new Codex. It's so cool. So in addition to retaining the old CP-free Deep Strike, Hawks have a new trick. When they make a battle focus move, they can now redeploy anywhere on the table immediately, not they go into Deep Strike and they come back in a turn, immediately, at least 9 inches away from enemy units. I'm crazy about this. Not only is it easy to have Hawks participate in the battle while keeping them totally out of the line of fire, because they make their Swooping Hawk move, they land, they shoot something, and then they battle focus completely out of line of sight of the enemy. But they can also grab any objective that your opponent leaves unattended. So they're just this crazy, harassing, like punishment, light cavalry style unit where they keep appearing, like dinging a thing, and their guns got better. And So their guns actually, with volume of fire, and also especially with the Bel-10 stratagem, which causes 6s to generate additional hits, and on 6s they now automatically wound on 6s to hit. 10 Swooping Hawks putting out 40 shots with 6s generating additional hits, and all of the 6s to hit automatically wounding, even though they don't have native AP except on the Exarch weapon. That is significant. And you could also use Jinx. We were saying there are still uses for these to make up for not having any AP. Swooping Hawks could be really scary, but even though they're not one of your most powerful shooting units, they're dangerous. They jump out, they harass something, they disappear, and then in late game they start punishing your opponent by taking objectives. They're so freaking good. It's such a good tool. They also have Exarch powers that make it such that when you shoot something, that unit can't perform actions, which is potentially really good, and a relic that gives them a durability boost. They can have, in addition to the native 5-up invuln that all Aspect Warriors have now, they can have a 5-up Feel No Pain. There's and I think the same relic gives the Exarch a 4+ invuln. There's so much room here to make this particular shenanigan one of the pillars of your competitive lists that I expect Swooping Hawks to see a lot of play. They're definitely a leading option for fast attack. Okay, the Phoenix Lord. Bahareth was the first special character I ever bought for 40k in, like, I don't know, 1997 or something, or maybe even 1996. And only now has my investment become worth it for anything other than the lore and the aesthetics. He's so good. Not only does he have the same redeployment power as the Hawks, but he can use it in place of a consolidation move. So this means that this most gallant of Phoenix Lords can now land within a few inches of an enemy on make a regular move, not obviously out of deep strike, but land 3 inches from an enemy, shoot that unit, charge that unit, attack the unit in melee, and then fly away before the opponent can hit you back and land on some distant objective, and just keep doing this. And by the way, all Phoenix Lords have OPSEC now, and grant OPSEC to Aspect Warriors of their type if they're nearby. And they have crazy durability bonuses. They've got 6 wounds. They can't take more than 3 wounds in a single phase. And there's a stratagem that lets you resurrect each of them once on a dice roll. So suddenly, this guy's amazing, right? He's a tremendous resource, both for scoring and for harassing enemy units at his price point. I think one of the hardest decisions for me in building Craftworld's lists will be deciding which Phoenix Lord or Lords. I think it'll be hard to fit more than 2, just because everything is expensive, but which ones to take? There's so many that are good. I think they all have play. I think there are a couple that aren't quite where the other ones are, but again, we'll get to this when I do the full Codex review. But if you've been sitting on that old Phoenix Lord model from the 90s, your time has finally come. He's amazing. Okay, Falcons. This is the other one. I am utterly shocked at how good Falcons are suddenly. They can perform a deep strike any turn of the game, including turn 1, and the models inside can disembark and shoot or charge that same turn. The tactical options that this opens up are insane. Now, the most obvious move to stick to is 6 Fire Dragons, and you drop the Falcon in your opponent's backfield, you obliterate key units. Dragons hit so much harder than they used to, and the Pulse Laser on the Falcon also is way better now. It's heavy 2, strength 9, -3 AP, D3 +3 damage. You can also put a Bright Lance on there. So a Falcon full of dragons, all of which do D6 +2, even when they're not at close range, and the Exarch does D6 +4, plus the weapon loadout on the Falcon, that's crazy. If you have 2 Falcons full of Fire Dragons and you drop them in your opponent's backfield, suddenly it doesn't matter quite as much that they can't climb back in the tank, because very little will survive that firing solution. That said, it's really not clear that that's necessarily going to be the best way to use Falcons. There are so many other ways that you could use them. You could drop some Banshees on your opponent's doorstep on turn 1, along with those 3 squads of Scorpions. Use a Strands of Fate die to guarantee a good charge roll. So the Scorpions all come in out of Deep Strike. They move their normal move. on turn 1, and then they charge. And on turn 1, the Banshees come in. You use Strands of Fate to guarantee them at least a 6-inch charge, and then you cast Ghost Walk, or a 7-inch charge, and then you cast Ghost Walk on them, and they can't fail either. So now you have 3 units of Scorpions and 1 unit of Banshees that are all guaranteed to succeed on the charge, and you could put in that Falcon the Singleton Warlock with Ghost Walk to come in with the MSU Banshee squad. I mean, there's so many ways to use this unit. You could put 6 Dire Avengers in there with the Exarch, or 5 with the Exarch power that gives them objective secured, and maybe a support unit, support character, just to grab objectives. There are lots of ways to increase the fire output of Dire Avengers. There's a stratagem that lets them shoot a second time if they've taken a casualty, which is good for large units. There's just the Falcon offers so much play. I had hoped that it would move to the support slot, or the transport slot, excuse me, which would have been nice, but given the other buffs that it's gotten, I think actually that would have been unreasonable. I was imagining it continue to be basically the tank it was before, not some sort of drop pod. And again, this feels very Aeldari. It's a super powerful movement shenanigan, but it's very different from what we're using before. But I'm confident that Falcons are going to be enormously popular as a heavy support pick for the foreseeable future. All right. The Webway Gate. At first glance, the new Webway Gate appears to be among the most powerful tools in the Codex. It only costs 80 points. It's indestructible. It lets you put units into reserve at a reduced cost, and in theory, a player could set it up next to a midfield objective, where she could then, at will, drop units onto that objective during her movement phase, even if it means setting them up within engagement range of an enemy. It looks amazing. Somebody in my somebody mentioned to me on Discord, who's a subscriber, that with the new Dire Avengers powers, there's a way to allow them to shoot in melee. So you could even put a bunch of Dire Avengers into engagement range of the enemy, have them shoot in the shooting phase, and then club them with the butts of their shuriken catapults. And they fire 3 times now, and their catapults are at -2 AP. There's just so much potential here. But having had some time to consider the practical limitations, I am not sure that the Webway Gate will be the auto-include that it appears to be. Here's the problem. The rules specify that the portal needs to be set up at least 3 inches from all other terrain. In ITC tournament play, players take turns placing terrain, so it would be extremely easy for an opponent to either screen your Webway Gate out of the midfield entirely, or at least force you to put it, certainly screen you off the objectives, and force you to put it somewhere that really is not advantageous. In official GW tournaments, there's so much terrain on the board that the only way to put the Webway Gate down will probably be to use the rule that lets you replace a piece of terrain in your own backfield with a piece of faction-specific terrain, like a fortification. Aside from the fact that I really don't want to pay 80 points for the privilege of deploying units in my own backfield, removing a piece of terrain to do so probably means giving up a line of sight blocking asset, a much larger, even though the Webway Gate does provide cover, you're probably picking up something that blocks line of sight much more effectively. And Craftworlds just rely on having that terrain in turn 1. And I could be completely wrong. Maybe the Webway Gate will turn out to be amazing. I think that on 8th edition boards, it would have been amazing. But at the moment, I am just not convinced that it's going to be a strong contender for serious tournament play, because I think it just doesn't synergize well with the current terrain rules. All that said, one of my subscribers pointed out to me on Discord that according to rules as written, you could try to get around this by setting the 2 pieces of the Webway Gate tightly packed together such that they don't form a gate at all. It just says they have to be within 3 inches of one another. I am not doing that. Also, it's obviously going to get FAQ'd hard shortly after if someone tries pulling that in a tournament. It's just so gross. I mean, yes, rules is written. He's not wrong. And someone probably will do it, and then it'll get nerfed. But that is clearly not the intention behind that rule. Okay, final notes before I sign off and say I'll see you again tomorrow for the beginning of the full Codex deep dive. I love the Traveling Players rule. It's so good. This is the rule that lets you include a patrol of Harlequins in your Craftworld force without spending any CP and without suffering any penalties to faction bonuses, and this is a glorious callback to the lore and the original function of Harlequins in 2nd edition. It will also open up exponentially more list options because, for all intents and purposes, every Harlequin datasheet is now also a Craftworld's datasheet. And because of the new rule and because of the relationship to earlier iterations, I really don't feel like taking a patrol of Harlequins is violating the identity of a pure Craftworld list, especially if you're not taking a ton of them. Because historically, Craftworlds have brought Harlequins along regularly. There are 3 different Harlequin subfactions, and Harlequins are so strong. They too have changed. They've given some stuff up, but oh my goodness, they're so good. They have a better troops option than what we currently have. Rangers are good, but, and again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But the new Harlequins are even better than before, and I think that the synergies that this is going to create, especially with some of our melee units, is just insane. I love the fluff, I love the lore, and I love the competitive possibilities on the table. And again, it just makes the book that much deeper. Second last note, the Exarch Powers relic options make Aspect Warrior builds even more nuanced. So the new Exarch Powers and the Expert Relics, to be fair, are a super mixed bag in terms of quality. Some of the powers are crazy overpriced and not good. But there are enough good options that a single squad of soldiers from any aspect shrine can now be turned into an enormously powerful, if enormously expensive, powerhouse of murder elves, except for Reapers. Reapers are not nearly as good anymore. They're still fine, but like, we have so many better options. And I think one of the difficult decisions we're going to face when list building is how much we want to commit to any given unit of aspect warriors, because you can just keep making them. They start really good. And this is, again, one of the big differences between this and the 8th edition codex, where pretty much everything in the 8th ed codex started subpar, and then you had to make it good with overlapping bonuses and warlord traits and subfaction bonuses and stratagems and psychic powers. And now everything starts good, and then you make it better. So you could have a squad of Banshees that's 200 points and terrifying. You can have a squad of Banshees that's less than half that and still very, very good. And so deciding where to draw the line is going to be tough. Third parting thought. You can still use a version of your old competitive list, but in the long run, you're going to want to rethink your roster. So if you collected, in the beginning of 9th edition, let's say you collected an Expert Crafters Hunters of Ancient Relics list, and you're in need of a way to use it, because those are the models you have, and maybe you did something crazy like listen to me when you were collecting, and now you're wondering how you're going to make it work. You're not in a bad place. You can probably, if you run it as built-in, which will give you the front half of Expert Crafters, which is the more important half, the bonus to hit. So if you're running something like Singleton Warwalkers in there, you'll still have really good damage output. And there's also a solidly unique stratagem that will increase the damage output of those aspect warriors, like Shining Spears you probably had in there. 6s to hit, generate extra hits. Here's the other thing. Due to datasheet changes, that bonus you were getting from Hunters of Ancient Relics, where you got the extra attack on objectives, they gave that to all the melee units. So everything in your list just has that bonus all the time, even if you're not on objectives. You'll probably have to cut out one of your units, maybe even 2. But everything you have will hit a little harder. It can still do good work for you. And certainly in competitive play at your local club, you'll get mileage out of that in a big way. Nevertheless, I think that rather than trying to employ the same unit combos and tactics as before, taxes, we will all do a lot better if we start by completely rethinking our approach to Craftworld Eldar. And that's kind of cool, because theory crafting is, I think, one of the most enjoyable aspects of competitive play. And I think that probably the biggest obstacles that we're going to run into in our first months playing with the Codex are going to be obstacles that are being created by the expectations that we've learned to have after years of playing with the old Codex. And it's a new book. We're going to have to think differently about it. Okay. So more to come tomorrow. If you check out my YouTube channel on Sunday, I'll have up at least the first part of a full Codex review. And in the coming weeks, I'm hoping to revamp all the core content on the website and get to Harlequins and Ynnari as well. It's just a super exciting time to be pro elf. Lastly, please keep in mind that the book is new, and that means it's inevitably going to take us time to tease out its potential. I am positive that every content creator out there, including me, has failed to anticipate all of the angles, opportunities, synergies, and vulnerabilities that the book presents. But I do think we're going to all have tremendous fun figuring out what those are, and there's more than enough in this book to keep us busy and redesigning lists up until the hypothetically distant 10th edition codex. More soon. That's it for today. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would encourage you to click subscribe. If you liked the video, I hope that you will click like, and if you have your own thoughts on the new codex, I hope you will leave those below. Thanks, guys. More to come soon.